Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Collaborative Science Press Stories webinar series. This is Nick Soberal with the Science Collaborative. Thank you for joining us today to talk about something that's been a constant part of everyday life for many of us for the past few years, for better or for worse, and that is virtual engagement. So for today's webinar, we'll get a chance to learn some ways that collaborative science projects in particular have adjusted and where we can go from here. But before we get started, a few housekeeping items. For those new to the reserve system, and new to the webinar series, a quick bit of background. The National Estuarine Research Reserve System is a national network of unique research reserves, and this is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit. Each reserve site includes programs focused on land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. And the Science Collaborative supports science for estuarine and coastal decision makers by coordinating regular funding opportunities and supporting user-driven collaborative research, assessment, and transfer activities that address critical coastal management needs identified by the reserves. The webinar series features project teams supported by the Science Collaborative, program staff, and partners. Speakers share their unique approaches to addressing current coastal and estuarine management issues. And if that sounds interesting to you, we encourage you to join us for future webinars to learn about new methods to integrate experts and users of project outputs into the research process and how the research results and products might inform your own work. For some brief housekeeping, all attendees were muted upon entry. That's a handy feature of GoToWebinar that we have no control over, so we'll be handling questions via the Q&A feature and the console there. We encourage you to enter those questions at any time throughout the webinar as they occur to you, just so you don't forget them, and we'll try to get through as many as we can towards the end of the webinar. Anything that we don't manage to get to in session will be included in a slide deck that we will share after the fact as well. So the chat is also visible to organizers only, but you can use it to alert us of any technical issues that you might be having. And with that, I am happy to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Dr. Susanne Moser. Susi is a highly valued member of our Science Collaborative team, whose work focuses on adaptation to climate change, science policy interactions, climate change communication, and psychosocial resilience in the face of traumatic and transformative challenges associated with climate change. She is a geographer by training. She's contributed to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. She's partnered with different reserves to develop indicators of successful climate adaptation. And most recently, Susi worked with project teams to identify and understand challenges and opportunities of virtual engagement techniques and tools, which is what she'll be sharing with us today. And with that, I will pass it over to Susi.
Thank you so much, Nick. All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful to have you. And here I am with the great challenge of engaging you virtually, something you're probably really sick of, would rather have me come and do this in person. But here we are. That's the means we have, and it's a great way to connect, as you will hear. So the title says a lot about what I have learned from you all, and I will, talk in a moment about how I got to my insights. But it is really meant to understand how did this whole big shift to virtual engagement change how we do collaborative science. A lot of it obviously had to do with the virtual engagement of participants, but as you will see in these interviews, what unfolded was really looking at the impacts of the pandemic more generally on this kind of research and on the reserve system. So I hope that those of you who are not in the reserve system will still find yourselves echoed in that. I think a lot of the lessons are more broadly applicable. And I look forward to the conversation to see, where that, or to what extent it actually translates to other places. So quick overview, I want to just briefly say a word about, how I came to the insights that I'm presenting here, talk about the projects in the context in which they have worked over the 2 years of pandemic, and then go into the biggest part of this presentation is going to be the results that I found and some brief summary and implications of, just to sort of an upshot from that. I will say I will focus mostly on the impacts on the individuals, on the projects, and on the stakeholder engagement. I'm not talking so much about what it did to the reserve system as a whole. I will mention it, but it's not a main emphasis. There were a lot of insights about that. And I had conversations yesterday with Doug George and we'll have more conversations to basically see for, what opportunities we have to look at those system-wide impacts, which I think are really important to consider. But for this audience, which is broader than the NERRS system, I'm going to stick to the particular insights that I learned on the projects. So a word on the methodology. As you know, in the Science Collaborative, we're very interested in collaborative and co-designed research, transdisciplinary research, whatever your favorite word is. And so we designed a study together. It involved the advisory board for the Science Collaborative, the team, Doug and OCM, and with the advisory board, of course, we had representatives from each of the NERRS sectors: management, education, the coastal training program, the stewardship sector, and so on. So we had all those sectors represented in that. Basically, what we then did is to introduce this project to all the 20 projects that were funded in 2020 or beginning in 2020. And we introduced this project in the kickoff calls. Then there were regular check-ins with these teams, and it varies by the type of team, how frequently that happens. But essentially, there's information and notes from those calls, from about 1 to 4 calls before I ever got to do the in-depth interview with each of the project leads. Sometimes it was just with one person, sometimes with a collaborative lead, the project lead, and others involved. And then I synthesized and analyzed that to see what are the sort of big takeaways. So, all of that led to a draft synthesis that I ran by a couple of different teams or folks, and the final result is what you're hearing today. And with that, I simply want to just thank you all, those of you who participated in this, who provided this information, who are patient enough to keep answering our pesky questions about virtual engagement, and then, of course, answering the interview requests. So that was really helpful. All the projects are represented here. That said, not that by 20 projects, many of them are multi-reserve, involving 1, 2, 3, or sometimes almost all of the reserves. I can't say that this is representative, because this was a qualitative study that does not tell me how frequent the insights are. So when we get to a conversation about how severe or significant are some of these findings for the system as a whole, we will try to get more of the quantitative analysis, but that'll be a later step. So just take this as a cautionary note on what I'm presenting. Now, what kind of projects and what is the context? As you see here, underlying this particular slide is the COVID curve that probably many of you are familiar with, and the ups and downs that we all experienced. So you all started these projects in 2020, and the pandemic was officially called in March 2020. So that's when we all had to suddenly go into lockdown. Just remember those days and how limited the number of cases were back then compared to some of what we've experienced since. So you all have been through a lot, and we all have, whether it's with these projects or not, but it changed the context for your work. Some of the projects were 1 year long, some of them are 3 year long, some of them were intended to start right in 2020, and because they were designed as in-person projects, they had much later start dates. The complexity of the projects, whether it's one or a few reserves involved versus many reserves involved, how much of the other players around the reserves, other partners are involved, all that makes, for very different contexts, for a wide variety of safety protocols, institutional requirements, who got to go into the lab, into the office, do field work or not. So that all changed again and again over the course of these 2 years. The little arrow that you see here at the bottom, the red arrow in January, that was when I conducted the interview. So we were again at a significant peak in the COVID cases, but not necessarily a lockdown like we did in the beginning. So it's very interesting how that changed and was continually sort of it was never a set condition for any of the projects. So that flexibility or that variability required ongoing adaptation, as you'll hear in a moment. And the other sort of dimension of difference in all these projects is the diversity of end users that they were targeted toward. Some of them just did those projects for the reserves, for other reserves. Some of them involved local and state decision makers or natural resource managers in and around the reserve that they worked with. Some of them involved landowners. And so again, you have private individuals, you have people guided by government regulations or rules around COVID. All of that constantly shifted and makes the individual projects not necessarily easily comparable. What's interesting though is just how consistent the findings were that I will show you. So that gives me some confidence that we are actually in pretty solid waters here with what I found. There was also some project staff turnover that affected a little bit how the projects were conducted. I'll just simply mention that, but this is just to set the context of both the projects and the context in which they were delivered. I'm going to move now to show you the results, and I organized that in 6 categories. So starting out with sort of giving you a big picture overview of what I found, what the pandemic itself did to the projects as a whole, how the different types of projects adjusted, a brief piece here on technologies and techniques that were used in virtual engagement and how the lessons that were learned in using them, and then again take the broader look out to what are the benefits and losses that people experienced due to all the shifts that had to be made during the pandemic. What advantages and successes or failures in inverted commas. When we interviewed, I asked people like what bombed, and quite frankly, it was for all intents and purposes nothing really bombed, and everybody is just in such a learning mode that those short-term failures were actually just wonderful lessons that we all can benefit from. So, but there were also some comments about sort of perpetual shortcomings of virtual engagement that I want to bring out. And then the conversation in the interviews ended on sort of lasting impacts of the pandemic, what people hope for, what they're afraid might happen, and what they now long for. And I think that speaks a lot to the human dimension of this pandemic. So let me jump right in and give you a sense of what I found. So the big picture is really, really looking not just at the virtual engagement part of this, but how the project and the implementation was affected in general. The impact on the NERRS system as a whole, I thought was a really interesting one. And there are many, many different dimensions to this, but one of the ways in which people expressed that was we've gone through something together. It's like a hurricane. When a community survives a hurricane. And in that same sense, it has both put a huge strain on the system, but also in some ways pulled the system closer together, which I think is a really important thing. Impacts on the project staff themselves, a few cases of COVID, of course, among project staff, greater demands on the project leads and collaborative leads in particular. A lot of people suffered from the isolation. And I guess what I would say there is it was generally harder for the extroverts and easier for the introverts. And that benefit was just reversed, I guess, with the virtual engagement. Virtual engagement was really hard for the introverts, but kind of easier for the extroverts. That was sort of the general tendency I observed. A lot of people mentioned the responsibility they felt to decide over people's safety, particularly when it comes to engagement in these projects. And that was, not an easy one to hold. the general tendency was to go with a very precautionary, very conservative approach, and nobody was pressured to do anything. Also, people noted that there was much greater team participation than they probably would have expected if this was a regular context or normal kind of context in which they usually have worked. Delays for or failures of students and postdocs research were mentioned as important implications. Imagine if you're a master's student or a PhD student and you're coming to your second, third year, now is the time to do your research to close your degree, right? You can't wait 2 years for something to open up again. So for those researchers in particular, it was that was highlighted as a significant impact. Impacts on the research or project implementation per se, there were some delays in starts, or certain project elements like lab and field work were delayed because they had to be closed. There couldn't be more than so many people in a lab at a time, you know, all the safety protocols that had to be worked out. Project slowdowns, no cost extensions, and you know, basically changing the implementation, not changing entirely the projects. No project was abandoned. Nothing is, you know, completely didn't work, but there were definitely adjustments made, and I'll come back to that in more detail. The technology changes were to some extent expensive to replace and to update, and you know, those projects that dependent on a particular type of technology, that by the time they got to then actually work on the technology had already been improved, and it made no sense to go back to the old technology. That was an expensive sort of reinvestment, if you will. There are several mentions of losses or much fewer data or major data gaps because of lack of access or damage to field sites and labs, which is why you see a crocodile and mollusks there, you know, barnacles on various instruments. That's the kind of dangers you have to work with, I suppose, when you can't get to the field site and fix it. Less insight into the context, both social, ecological, and terrain of decision makers was another significant loss that people noted in the research per se. Impacts on the home institution. There was at least one person who mentioned that their institution, their research lab actually closed, and all the staff are now doing their work from at home, or most of the buildings have been closed. So that's an interesting, at least a unique, but maybe not unique in the broader research environment, but for this set of projects, it was a unique impact. Of course, there were impacts on the stakeholders or the end users. In some ways, a positive impact was that, you know, with so many people being used to now going online, was much greater attendance, better geographic representation. There were, you know, a lot of demands on end users at the same time, right? We all know the homeschooling plus, you know, taking care of, you know, dependents and work all from the home office. That was difficult for the staff as much as for the end users. And so the demands on them could, in some ways, had to be lessened. With some end users, project staff mentioned they lost touch just because they weren't so flexible in moving into the virtual space. And on the other hand, some participation increased, like local government staff was in many ways far more available to come to virtual meetings than they would have come to in-person meetings. So they had, you know, the connections to making, or sorry, the making new connections, that was something that people sort of had varying success with. Some said, yep, it worked a lot better, and others said, no, we didn't reach as far as we would want it to go. There were supply chain issues in not getting equipment or materials in time, and price increases that had then fiscal impacts on the projects. The other fiscal impact was that travel budgets went completely down, and so there were, you know, some exchange, and there's a general appreciation for how flexible the Science Collaborative helped them basically move things around in their budgets. So that was a really good one. And then generally, a benefit that was just mentioned was that so much got easier because of the virtual engagement technology, because it was pervasive, it was better, more options. and so many more people used to actually using it. So for many of the projects, that actually was a benefit. I was surprised how many times I heard how the pandemic actually was a good thing for the projects. Now, how did the projects adjust? I want to sort of discuss this in two rubrics. One is there were a number of projects that were already regional or national in scope that already were meant to be virtual, and then others that were really meant to be in person with direct contact, and they had to make very different adjustments. In the first instance here, basically this is the group that said things just got easier. While they might have had delays in start and implementation, in general, that group of projects just felt, it was actually a boon to them to have all these additional tools, have people be more used to it. They felt there was an increase in internal and team interactions. While they, in respect of everyone's added demands of, multitasking from wherever they are, there were certainly, there was sort of a shift to making these meetings internally non-mandatory and then using all the online technologies to essentially share the information anyway. Many of those projects depended or had intended to go to the annual meeting of the NERRS system, and since that didn't happen, they then had to develop alternative ones, so they had to create new ones that they didn't intend or didn't mean to have. The second group of projects had greater delays, in one case or two cases up to a year, to basically shift all the hands-on work, all the all the shifts that they needed to make, and engagement and field work and lab work, moving, either waiting until that was possible again, especially in cases where there was dependence on hands-on work in the field or the timing of species and capturing that. You can't do that in the off season. You don't get what you want it to. And of course, those projects didn't just sit around. They actually did some really interesting work that might have otherwise not happened, or that might have, just in shifting tasks in the project around by shifting from the intended empirical data collection up front to synthesizing information that they already had to kind of conceptualize maybe what the data collection had to be. What they had to deal with, maybe more so than all the others, was this constant shifting of the situation and the institutional context, the guidelines. This lab can, or this reserve can meet in person, this one can't. Or here we can gather outside, but not more than 10 people, and now it's not more than 30 people. You all know the situation. So that's the ones where they were constantly tiptoeing to figure that out. There was some really interesting creative uses, and particularly with where people from the education sector were involved, some really creative online teaching. Teachers were hungry for that. So in some ways, they just rose in importance in a way that, they hadn't even expected to be as important, but it really demanded a lot to make that happen. Also, people mentioned the constant communication, both within the team and with their end users, and the sort of guiding question being simply, what are you comfortable with? Are you willing to come? Are you willing for people to have no masks on or with masks on? Whatever, any of those things. You all have done this sort of thing, right? But there's a lot of steep learning of how often can we meet? How long can we meet? I'll come back to those. When stakeholders were involved initially, people just, rushed into participation and everybody got overwhelmed. And in part, this was also people, things slowing down and things opening up. So then there was a decline in participation, even though you might have expected or planned for much higher participation. Then you got to go out back in the field, and the enthusiasm just brought people back in. So there's a lot of sort of shifting in participation of the partners or stakeholders that people worked with. And this group, more than others, really worried about computer access equity. and mentioned there were losses with some contexts that they wish to have. I'm not putting up anything that you don't know about the technologies or the techniques that were used, but I'll just list them here. And in no particular order of importance, although I think I heard Zoom probably more than any other, as we tend to do. But there are really significant differences in the capabilities of these technologies, and therefore, what techniques you can use, right? Can you use chat? Can you use Q&A? Can you have polling or not? Can you do interactive work right in the technology, or do you need to use other ones in addition to that, like Padlet or Slido or Mural or any of those? Anyway, I think what maybe the upshot of all of this is just how many different things are available now that weren't there 2 years ago, and how much more common, and we're probably most of us on this call would be having some facility with about 80% of what's on here in terms of how to use that. I don't want to miss mentioning also that, in addition to the particular technologies and platforms, safety protocols is important in this context, right? Where people need to use labs or need to go on boats or need to go in the field. And so those safety protocols varied pretty much from reserve to reserve. A couple of more lessons here from that. Pretty much across the board, I heard that relationships are more important than whatever fancy thing you can use. I mean, people were excited about the technologies, don't get me wrong, but in the end, it was, can we, get what we want from them, and can we maintain and build relationships with the people, because that's what we really all needed and what's the most important to make these projects work. Almost everything is possible to do virtually. I was just so impressed with not only that finding, but some of the creative ideas that I did hear from particularly the coastal training program folks and the education sector folks, who just have gotten so expert in using all these tools. So, but patience and practice, patience and practice, patience and practice. I heard that probably 100 times in these interviews. That's I think what we all need to take away from that. People warned against being too complex and trying to use too fancy things when, particularly if you're not really, really good at using it, and urged instead that sometimes going simple is just the best. And sort of related to that, beware of form over function. So if something looks really good or nice, but it's really hard to work, you just make your life a lot harder. And at the same time, there's sort of this recognition that you need to vary to keep people from getting bored. You need to adapt your techniques and technologies for different types of meetings or audiences. And a big lesson, I guess, learned is that people felt breakout groups generally are too short, and you don't go or get anywhere if you don't make really a lot of space for that. Now, a little bit more about the benefits and losses that people experienced. So this is really taking a big look, at the pandemic in general. The ease and efficiency of attending meetings by essentially a click of the button on the computer, that beats a lot of standing in line for getting tickets or getting on flights and whatnot. So that plus much less time spent on travel were the most frequently mentioned benefits of this pandemic. There were a whole bunch of social things emphasized again and again, and that is that people felt like they're valuing their colleagues and their partners a lot more. Or as one put it, colleagues became friends, or in some instances, better friends. People also appreciated that the virtual engagement in particular made it possible for end users from a much broader geographic region than they otherwise would. You can get people in a day's drive or half a day's drive to come to a meeting. but now they can have people who are much further away to participate. And that just really boosted a lot of the impact and the insights that people could gain in these projects. They also really felt like they had to become more creative and more proactive in engaging the end users, which probably is something that's worth keeping. People felt they had become more respectful and mindful of the requests that they have of others, whether it's on the team or of end users, given all the other things. And, the interesting sort of finding around, now in this instance, you don't see it, but on Zoom, we're all the same size squares. We're not big squares and little squares. We're the same size. And that equalization effect, people felt helped in some instances to kind of level the playing field in terms of participation. There still was a lot of concern with sort of, dealing with the loud voices, people who always speak up, and lots of advice there on how to manage that. But that was an interesting insight that in some ways it made it easier for people from, of all stripes and people who are more introverted and extroverted to participate on a more equal level. And the sense that it's more sharing the stage rather than, just spotlighting individuals. That was a sort of a benefit, I think, that speaks to sort of the spirit that you can create, the sense of inclusivity that you can create with these projects and in virtual environments. The losses were predominantly social. The human connection, the fraying of social ties, the loss of networking opportunities, out of which often come new project ideas, come new possibilities for interaction, where you get real-time feedback in a way that someone wouldn't do in a formal sort of feedback session. For many of the younger career people, this is opportunities to get really hooked into the field, find new opportunities. Those two things were mentioned probably more often than any other issue. You also miss a lot of nuance. It's very difficult to read body language when you only see the upper, quarter of a person. And people miss that they didn't see people in their context, whether that's the environmental landscape, but also the institutional context, the social landscape in which they worked. At the same time, people felt that the in-person interaction skills had apparently really gone down due to the long isolation. So maybe that's something we need to sharpen up a little bit more again. There was this, with a general overwhelm that we're all experienced, a lot of mention of we have no more time to think and reflect, which to me, frankly, is a significant and severe impact on our intellectual contribution if we can't do that anymore. Everyone mentioned the added stresses on staff, and that had to do with the personal challenges everyone was facing while doing their work, producing deliverables because of decreased expectations on end users, this added layer of fun with bureaucracy, if you will, when people needed to get travel permissions or permissions to go in the lab, the much greater time needed to plan meetings, and also delays in hiring. It just, left it oftentimes on the collaborative leads, but also the other project staff had much higher stress. And so people's burnout is one of the big take-homes from this pandemic. And I say that against the backdrop of a culture that is already, very much in overwork and a very high general burnout rate, higher than many other countries. So that's just something we need to think about. One of the benefits that I want to single out was people mentioning how often they felt like they actually build new skills, and it's the year or two of soft skills. Many talked about improved skills in terms of better facilitation, communication, making meetings more purpose-driven, more meaningful to people. The skill of scheduling people when managing your time while still hard pressed to make that work. A lot of people felt that was an improvement. Many talked about caring more about people, that they're really getting the importance of relationships in this collaborative science world that we're in, and felt they were more creative or had to get more creative, particularly in maintaining cultural forms of respect. For example, the importance of food or food sharing. When that falls away, how do you do that? Lots of people talked about the need to really improve their self-care and pacing for all body, mind, and spirit. And then a whole bunch of people talked, they learn new skills. Some of those projects you have to consider, they had projects leads that had never done anything like that. So for them to learn team leadership and tending or managing people from afar is a whole different set of skills than, you can just walk down the hallway and have people right there. Everyone talked about having to master all these virtual engagement technologies and learning organizational skills that were previously simply not necessary. The comfort with change and adaptability was highlighted for some as a new skill. And then also learning in a new way, right? So many of us learn by doing or by following somebody else, but you had to now learn by watching or hearing without having the modeling, right? So it really challenged some people to shift in their learning, preferred mode of learning, if you will. And the same is true, you have to remember, same is true for all the people we're engaging. And so this is something where being mindful of how your own learning is challenged, you become more creative in creating more opportunities for learning for others. A couple of things that people mentioned in terms of the advantages of virtual engagement, of course, travel opportunities, and simply to be in many places at the same time, that was mentioned by many. The ease of organizing a meeting online while taking a lot more time to plan well, it's a lot easier than having to do, food arrangements and travel arrangements and any of the sort of in-place logistics. People management, people felt was in many ways easier than, not entirely, but it felt easier to some to do in this virtual engagement. And what I mean by that in particular is managing the communication with loud voices or with, dominant people online. It's just, there's just ways you can, people learn to do that felt easier than doing that in person. The handling of multiple demands, while that was difficult, right? We all had to. If you had to do schooling and, taking care of your dependents and going to work, you need to have those things all to function. When they don't function because nobody is open, you have to make it as easy as possible to do all at home. And virtual engagement actually made that possible. Imagine a pandemic without that. A lot more people would have dropped out of work to take care of kids and do all that. People also mentioned the access to resources. We have pretty much everything on this laptop, on a computer. So when people say, oh, I should send you X, it's like, click away, which is a lot easier than if you talk to someone in person and then they have to remember that they said they promised to send you something later, right? So this is just a quick and efficient way to get that. People also talked about their successes. And, I have a picture here. Many of you will recognize this from Apollo 13 flight when they basically had to come up with the filter system out of nothing. And this is in many ways how many in the reserve system responded to this. The switch from analog to virtual, people just said, we learned we can pull it off just as well. That's something that is just astonishing. In some instances, people hired, people who are particularly good at it or got training, but just the fact that, we were able to do that speaks to our adaptability and ability to learn. Team interactions felt like they, checking in regularly on how much interaction and engagement people want, having running notes for team meetings. Those are not new inventions, but they became common, just because that's what worked when you have this kind of situation that we're all just lived through. creative virtual teaching, use of social media for visual tours, photo competitions, going birding with people when they can't go out, that sort of thing. Those kinds of creative solutions just really started to blossom. People's got greater respect for and understanding of social science, interestingly. In some ways, the whole human element just lifted up. But there was also a lot more respect for the engagement specialists, for particularly the coastal training program coordinators. So that, I think, is a really interesting system-wide impact. Time management, people learned to keep pace between meetings, block off time without meetings to get a break, to catch up, to follow up whatever they promised. So this sort of having it scheduled one after the other, you need a day when you don't have that just to keep up with all the follow-up, right? So people really learned how to manage that a lot more. Partner engagement, where they engaged their end users in creating invitee lists, and they got much larger lists than they ever had. And so that got just so much easier through the virtual ways. They also got a lot of larger turnout in many of instances. Greater focus on getting input from then pushing out information. So that, those lessons felt like important pieces of progress. And then getting input from all voices, even the quiet people. I want to spend just a moment on that. Offering anonymous or asynchronous input opportunities, using the breakout groups in creative and effective ways. So do you use random assignment? Well, that might work for brainstorming when people are respectful and mindful of each other. But when you have really loud voices and that, then put all the loud voices together in one group. That's something you can do so much more easily in the virtual world than you can without necessarily having to tell people about that. But that way you don't have the sort of shutting down of people. You can also manage conflict in that way a little bit more easily. And you can assign people to very specific tasks. So in some ways, this virtual world has somehow maybe taught us a way to do that even when we go back to being in person. People got also bold, simply telling the loud voices to hold back in funny, creative ways of doing that. Interrupting when people dominate, having one-on-one conversations with people to avoid sort of that, particularly the ones that are quiet, they might be much more willing to speak in that format. And becoming comfortable with waiting in silence. When people don't speak doesn't mean they're not engaged, it just means they're thinking. And so having to learn to be patient with that silence. And maybe staying on a bit longer after an official meeting is over so that those who are less willing to speak in group are willing to come up. A couple of mentions here too on the inverted comma failures or shortcomings of virtual engagement. The meeting design and follow-up is sort of a grouping of issues of where people said, oh, we just went on way too long with the presentation part, or the meeting was too long. Or they felt like they couldn't recreate the sort of socializing in any real tangible way. People bailing when going into the breakout groups, which might speak to people just being shy, not wanting to, being exhausted, not wanting to be engaged in that way. Or simply, not doing well with the technology because it's too complicated. So you end up having this embarrassing meeting where you struggle more with the technology than getting to your content. People also felt like they booked too much into the meetings at first, and they had to really learn to scale back and make just one or two issues a focus for the meetings, and then not following up. So there was no good line of engagement between those virtual meetings. Those were important. People felt really challenged around time management and scheduling. The delegation is harder, getting people to come together. So many more shorter meetings is actually super time consuming. Lots of uncertainty about whether or not all the voices or all the necessary end users are actually being reached. that was a challenge, and then simply recognizing how fatigued we all are, both the people we were engaging, but also we ourselves. So I heard it more than once, Zoom fatigue is real. So that's important. And I want to just simply invite maybe the Science Collaborative staff to put a couple of handouts in the chat here for you. There were a lot of wonderful lessons learned from all of these experiences, and I put them all together. They were tips for virtual engagement, for hybrid meetings, and for asynchronous engagement. And I thought that would be really helpful to people. And then people also raised really interesting questions of what they wanted to know from each other. And some of those are answered here, but there are others that we're going to address in the quarterly workshops, maybe in the Q&A. I just want to not let them be lost here, because I think there are wonderful food for thought. So even those of you who are not in the systems, who will not be in these workshops, that will follow this, I encourage you to bring those up with your team as a way to maybe see, how does your team do with that? And how to, how are you doing? Maybe as a tool for self-reflection. So I just, and even, where the comments are more about the NERRS system, many of you are in partnerships or who have programs, and you might wonder how your program as a whole has been affected. So let me just leave you with a couple more slides here on the lasting impacts, and then on the sort of upshot of that, and then open to Q&A. And for the lasting impacts, I want to sort of group that into three categories: what people hope will stay, what people are afraid will stay, and what people are hoping or longing for is over and they can do again in the analog world. So in the hope section, maybe the big lesson about the social connections and the importance of relationship and of being more human with each other, that is something a lot of people said, I hope that will stay. The greater empathy and tolerance for people's having a hard time, really creating spaces for care in meetings. So not just making them functional and content-based, but actually checking in with sincerity. How are you doing? That, they hope that will actually stay. The lower environmental impact, because we're traveling less, we're not in traffic jams, we're not flying as much. That was really appreciated, with people hoping that, let's get together in local meetings, but have much fewer long distance meetings and conferences. And then the flexibility. So many people said, I can't see going back to the office. I love working from at home. It gives me so much flexibility. So lots of people want that. Not everybody, but lots of people want that. So simply having the flexibility of how to do that might really improve morale and productivity for a lot of people. What about the fears? Some people really worried that the pandemic, and you have to remember, climate change, racism, economic, hardship, all of that happened at the same time, right? People experienced trauma, and people were worried that that would leave a lasting impact. Also, a lot of worries about the fraying social fabric. In part, the distrust and fears in some parts of the world around polarization around vaccines, and really worried about, the threads have gotten a little thin after 2 years of being essentially virtual and isolated. Lots of worries about the negative impacts on students and early career researchers, either because they've lost contact entirely, which will have lifelong impacts on those students, or they lost sort of the experience of being socialized into a field. They have much greater hurdles of entering a career, or being recruited into the field. And then also that sort of constant fear that we seem to have developed of missing out on something. So, if all the conferences are virtual, but you can only, handle in your brain to go to so many a week or a month, which used to be normal, by the way, before we did that, right? Now it's like, if I don't show up for all the estuarine research or coastal conferences, am I missing out on something important? So that seems to stay. And then the longings, oh my God. I mean, can I have lobster with you again? Can I go back out in the field? I can't wait to do my field work. People actually, and this is again the split between the extroverts and introverts, some people really longing to go to the conferences for all those social and networking opportunities, going back to the office for that, having seminars to be intellectually stimulated in that way. And, you know, and others like, I'm fine not having to do that. Thank you very much. Most people said they wanted virtual engagement to be just one tool in the box as opposed to the only one we're afforded. And then again, the split on traveling, either traveling less for all the benefits that I mentioned, and others would be like, oh, I can't wait to travel again. So what does it all come down to? What I would say is, in general, the system and these projects have done an incredible job of keeping things going under really dire consequences or situations and conditions. You know, the NERRS system does a lot of environmental monitoring, and many of them have kept that up. The reserve management in and of itself was a challenge. The implementation of the research project, the relationships, the staff morale, it's just incredible what actually was achieved. What I think helped was people's willingness and ability to be flexible, this caring that I mentioned, the commitment and passion for the work, the enabling technology for sure, and this deeply embedded social capital in the NERRS system that people drew on. I would say it's time to put back in the bank. People were worried, as I mentioned, about the sort of social ties fraying, but there was definitely a sense that that helped. And overall, I would say the appreciation of people who are really good at this engagement and who switched completely in the mode of engagement, that just raised their the appreciation for what their work is. In terms of the future of virtual engagement, as I mentioned, many hope some aspect of that stays but becomes part of the portfolio as opposed to be the only thing. It does absolutely not replace direct human contact, the networking, and does come at a huge cost. And you know, that I think I just want to say, I don't want to hide or somehow gloss over the cost, the burnout that was sort of what we all had to pay to succeed in this way that I just mentioned. So replenishment, I think, is in order, and we could talk about what that means. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the system-wide implications we'll be discussing more before. So I'll turn it here to over to Nick for Q&A, and then we can share the slides and everything later. So
thanks, Susie, and thanks so much for walking us through your research project, which was just so interesting to hear all this stuff summarized. We've got a few minutes for questions here, so we'll try to crank through as many as we can. If you have questions that are coming to mind while we're walking through some of the Q&A stuff, please just do submit them. And if once the session ends, if you still have questions, just you can put them in either the Q&A, if you enter them into the question console, it'll stay in the session, so I'll see them that way, or you can put them in the exit survey that'll come out after the webinar. Okay, so we have a couple questions here. First one up I see here, someone said that they've been surprised to find it's been hard to engage the younger generation in a virtual space. For example, I was in a meeting where the students did not use their cameras, did not use chat or speak up, and bailed during the breakouts. Did you see similar demographic patterns and any ideas on how to get to that target audience?
Yeah, that's interesting. So there were definitely some mentions of the differences in engagement. I mean, and it varied over time. So the engagement, excuse me, with students, for example, by people from the education sector, you know, as soon as they figured out how to switch to the virtual engagement and how to make that interesting, the teachers were just, I mean, just coming to them with, please help us out, and anything that people could come up with to rig up some sort of virtual hands-on experience was very much appreciated, and people were engaged in that. So it definitely worked, but the fatigue for students having to be online all the time, that was certainly mentioned. I also heard comments about a lot of the sort of direct engagement with seniors at the reserves was interrupted because they couldn't come to the reserves, but they weren't easily switching to online engagement. I mean, eventually many seniors figured that out, but there was definitely a mention of, the loss of that particular group of the population, and they re-engaged, once things opened up. But there was, I don't think anybody had a solution for it other than, the advice of going to a variety of modes of reaching people. Many seniors are actually quite comfortable with email, and so, switching to that. Some people mentioned that it was easier to use WhatsApp with camera, instead of a phone. So that was a way to engage with some groups better than others. They also mentioned that some groups were all of a sudden accessible that weren't before, like ranchers or fishermen or something like that might have been in lockdown, but they had those technologies. So it was really quite a varied impact on different groups, different sectors, and different age groups. Maybe that's enough for this question, but there was no simple solution mentioned.
So no simple solution, but maybe try other platforms that are, more popular in some of those generations. Got it. Okay, so next question. What techniques have teams used to get closer to those social connections that are not always easy to achieve virtually? So some ideas, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I heard things of really making, creating these spaces of care. So really leaving time for check-in. I heard ideas of sending people little care packages, doing virtual beers, those kinds of things. I'm sure we all came up with these eventually at some point or another, having some kind of cup of something to drink, together over this means. So I think a lot of it ended up being in the one-on-one spaces, also where people just had closer connections because it felt more like a phone call. And actually the shift to, from Zoom away from the camera to being on the phone in that more traditional mode of connection. I think I've heard that a bunch of times. Trying to think if there were any others. Well, I heard in a couple of projects where the culture requires, or the cultural norm is that food becomes a really important part of meetings. So in those instances, people got really creative about sending people packages of food, culturally appropriate food, so that they felt that norm was sustained. So, people got really creative around that.
Sure. And maybe one last question here that we can end on. Are there certain moments in a project where you think that the social connections matter the most? Like what's one spot where you think it matters the most?
In any one project?
Yeah, a moment in the project where you think it maybe matters more than in other parts of the project, or the most.
I don't think I heard that. I had interesting conversations about, does it matter to have virtual first and then in person, or in person and then going to virtual? And from the impression I got from the conversations I had with teams about that, it works both ways. There was no one said, oh my God, you can't do, you can never start just with virtual and then make a project work. It absolutely worked. Some projects got started virtually and then eventually over time had the ability to get together, and it was like a reunion for people. So it worked absolutely wonderful. And in other instances, people insisted that there was no way it would have survived if they had not had personal contact first before they went to virtual. So people are bimodal about this. And, I think people recognize it varies how much people want to be engaged at different times, and you just simply have to really stay in contact with them to find out how much is too much, how little, how little do they want, to not overburden them, to be much more respectful of the engagement and give them many different forms of engagement. So, more modes than one. If you only depend on a meeting, a virtual meeting, that probably will cause you to lose some people because that's just not comfortable for them, or they don't have the time, whatever. But they will give you input if you give them a task by email or on an online Padlet or something like that. So there was no pattern as to what's most important. More like the takeaway for me was all forms work. You've got to constantly check what works for the people you're working with.
Sure. Well, I think that's a good note to end on. I want to thank everybody who submitted questions. I want to thank everyone who took the time to participate with us today and listen to Susi's presentation. And of course, I want to thank Susi for putting together such a thoughtful presentation and for leading this great effort to really look across and distill these lessons that people have learned over the past couple of years. So a big thank you to Susi. And for next steps, we'll be sure to get this recording out in the next few days and make that available via the YouTube channel. If you want to stay informed of other upcoming webinars, our next one is on April 19th. You can sign up for that and for announcements about webinars with the link I just provided in the chat. And with that, I want to wish everyone a wonderful rest of your day and go do great things.
Thanks so much.